The carriage rattled through the iron gates of Wistmore Hall just as the last light of evening slipped behind the hills, and Clara Bennett pressed her gloved hand against the cold window glass, her heart pounding so hard she thought the driver might hear it. She was a bride now. She was the Duchess of Wistmore, and she had no idea what that would truly cost her. 3 weeks earlier, Clara had been nothing more than a schoolteacher's daughter from a small town, mending her own dresses and counting coins for bread. Then Edmund Hale, the Duke of Wistmore, had walked into her town during a hunting trip, seen her laughing with children outside the schoolhouse, and decided in that instant that he wanted her. He was tall, composed, and impossibly charming, with a voice that made every word sound like a promise. Clara had never met anyone like him. Within days he was sending flowers. Within a week he had asked for her hand. Within a month they were married in a small stone chapel with only a handful of witnesses, because Edmund did not like to wait for anything he wanted. Clara's mother had wept with joy at the wedding, certain her daughter's hardships were over. Her father had shaken Edmund's hand with the stiff pride of a man who still could not quite believe his daughter would live in a manor with 40 rooms. Clara herself had felt like she was floating through someone else's life, a life pulled straight from the pages of the romance novels she used to read by candlelight. A duke. A castle on a hill, a love story that seemed too perfect to be real. Now, sitting in the carriage as it crossed onto Wistmore land for the first time as its mistress, Clara allowed herself to believe that perfect things could happen to ordinary girls. She glanced at Edmund beside her. He was watching her with an expression she could not quite name, hunger, maybe, or anticipation. And when he caught her looking, he smiled and took her hand. "You will love it here," he said. "Everything in this house exists for your comfort now." Clara smiled back, though something in his tone made her stomach flutter in a way that was not entirely pleasant. She told herself it was nerves. Every new bride felt nerves. The hall itself took her breath away. Candles lined the long entrance corridor, their light dancing off gold-framed portraits of Hale ancestors who all seemed to stare down at her with the same sharp, assessing eyes as their descendant. A row of servants stood waiting to greet her, dressed in crisp black and white, their faces polite and unreadable. At the end of the line stood an older woman with silver hair pulled into a tight bun and eyes that seemed kinder than the rest. "This is Margaret," Edmund said. "She has run this household for 20 years. She will see to anything you need." Margaret curtsied, but as she rose, her gaze lingered on Clara for a moment longer than courtesy required. There was something in that look, not unkindness, but a kind of quiet warning, gone as quickly as it appeared. Clara would think of that look many times in the weeks to come, though on this first night she barely noticed it at all, too dazzled by chandeliers and marble floors to read anything into a housekeeper's glance. Dinner was served in a dining hall large enough to seat 60, though only 2 chairs were set at one end of the long table, close together. Edmund talked through the meal about his family's history, about the lands he owned, about plans for the estate now that he had a duchess to share it with. Clara listened, charmed despite herself, laughing at his jokes, feeling for the first time that perhaps this fairy tale was not going to shatter after all. It was only when the servants cleared the final course and withdrew, leaving the 2 of them alone in the candle-lit hall, that Edmund's tone shifted. He rose from his chair, walked around the table, and pulled Clara gently to her feet. "I have waited 3 weeks to have you to myself," he said, his voice low. "I don't intend to wait any longer." Clara's cheeks warmed. She was, after all, a new bride, and she had expected this night to come. She had even looked forward to it, in the nervous, fluttering way young women look forward to such things. What she had not expected was the intensity in Edmund's eyes as he led her up the grand staircase, an intensity that made her think, for just a flicker of a moment, of something closer to hunger than affection. She pushed the thought away. He was her husband. He loved her. Whatever she was feeling was simply the strangeness of a new life, a new house, a new role she had not yet grown into. The night that followed left Clara exhausted in a way she had not anticipated, and confused by a demand Edmund made of her before he finally allowed her to sleep. A demand she assumed, in her innocence, was simply how such things worked among people of his class. She did not yet have the experience to know otherwise. She only knew that when she woke the next morning, the sun already high above the hills, her whole body ached with a tiredness that sleep alone should have cured. She found Edmund already dressed, standing at the window of their chamber, looking out over his lands like a king surveying a kingdom. When he heard her stir, he turned and smiled the same easy, charming smile that had won her heart in the first place. "Good morning, my Duchess," he said. "Did you sleep well?" Clara opened her mouth to answer honestly, then closed it again. She did not yet have the words for what she was feeling, and she did not want to disappoint him on only their second morning as husband and wife. So she smiled instead and said that she had slept just fine. Edmund crossed the room, kissed her forehead, and told her that Margaret would help her dress for the day, that he had a state business to attend to, and that he would see her again that evening. As he reached the door, he paused and looked back at her with that same hungry look from the night before. "Tonight," he said almost casually, "we will do better than last night. I want to make sure you understand what it means to be my wife." He left before she could ask what he meant. Clara sat alone in the enormous bed, sunlight pouring through tall windows onto silk sheets that had cost more than her family's entire house, and felt, for the very first time since the carriage had crossed the gates of Wistmore Hall, a small cold seed of doubt take root somewhere beneath her ribs. She told herself it was nothing. She told herself that every marriage required an adjustment period, that every bride felt overwhelmed in her first days in a new home with a new husband and new responsibilities. She dressed with Margaret's help, wandered the gardens that afternoon, wrote a cheerful letter to her mother describing the fountains and the rose beds and the peacocks that strutted across the lawn, and did not mention, even to herself in the privacy of her own thoughts, the strange weight that had settled over her since the night before. But as evening approached, and the shadows in the long corridors of Wistmore Hall grew longer, Clara found her hands trembling slightly as she prepared for dinner, and she could not entirely explain why. Dinner that second night passed much like the first, Edmund charming and attentive, refilling her glass, telling stories about his childhood in this very house, about the tutors who had taught him and the horses he had loved, and the father whose expectations he had spent his whole life trying to meet. Clara found herself softening toward him again, remembering why she had fallen for him so quickly in the first place. He was clever and funny, and he looked at her like she was the only woman in the world. Surely a man who looked at her that way could not be anything but good to her. It was after the servants withdrew, once again leaving them alone with the candles and the long shadows, that Edmund's charm sharpened into something else entirely. He stood, came around the table, and this time there was no gentleness in the way he pulled her to her feet, only a kind of restless urgency that made Clara's breath catch. "I told you," he murmured against her ear, "that I wanted 5 times a night. Last night we managed only 3. Tonight we will not fall short again." Clara went very still. She was not entirely certain in her innocence exactly what such a number meant in practice, but the tone of his voice, the tightness of his grip on her wrist, told her enough to feel a genuine flicker of alarm beneath the fog of wine and candlelight. "Edmund," she said carefully, "I am still very tired from last night. Perhaps we could—" "Perhaps we could what?" he interrupted, though his voice remained light, almost teasing, as though she had made a small joke rather than voiced a real concern. "You are my wife, Clara. This is simply what marriage is. You will grow used to it soon enough. Every duchess before you has managed." He said it so simply, so matter-of-factly, that Clara found herself doubting her own instincts rather than his words. Perhaps this truly was ordinary. Perhaps every woman who married into a great house learned to expect this, and her own upbringing in a small, quiet town had simply left her unprepared for the realities of a grander life. She thought of her mother, who had never spoken of such things, who had only told her, on the morning of the wedding, that a good wife did whatever made her husband happy. So Clara said nothing more. She let Edmund lead her from the dining hall, up the grand staircase, past the portraits of ancestors whose painted eyes seemed to watch her pass, and into the bedchamber where the fire had already been lit and the candles already trimmed low. By the time the house fell silent that second night, Clara lay staring at the canopy above the bed, every muscle in her body aching, her mind blurred with exhaustion, and Edmund already asleep beside her, breathing deep and even utterly untroubled. She turned her head and looked at him in the dim firelight, the strong jaw, the handsome face, the man the whole county considered the finest match a woman could hope for, and felt, for the first time in her young life, entirely and completely alone. Outside the tall windows, an owl called somewhere in the dark woods beyond the gardens, and Clara Bennet, now Duchess of Wistmore, closed her eyes and wondered, with a fear she could barely admit even to herself, exactly what kind of life she had married into, and whether there would be any way, in a world built entirely around her husband's wishes, for her own voice to ever be heard at all. The days at Wistmore Hall began to take on a shape Clara had not expected from married life, a shape built around long, quiet mornings alone, comfortable afternoons among gardens and books, and nights that left her feeling as though she had run for miles without ever leaving the bedchamber. She began, without quite meaning to, counting the days since her wedding, and marking them not by happiness but by how tired she felt when she woke. Edmund was never unkind to her in daylight. He complimented her dresses, admired the way she arranged flowers in the drawing room, sent for a piano tuner when she mentioned she used to play, and seemed, in every visible way, the model of a devoted husband. It was only after the candles were lit and the servants withdrew each evening that his manner changed, that the warmth in his eyes sharpened into something more demanding, something that treated Clara less like a partner and more like an obligation to be fulfilled. She had tried, gently on the fourth night, to ask whether they might simply rest. "I only wonder," she had said carefully, twisting the edge of her sleeve between her fingers, "if perhaps we might have a quieter evening tonight. I have felt rather unwell since yesterday." Edmund had studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable, before letting out a short laugh that held no real humor in it. "Unwell," he repeated. "Clara, you are the picture of health. I have given you everything a woman could want. The least you can give me in return is a little energy." The words had stung more than she expected, not because they were cruel exactly, but because they made her sound ungrateful, selfish, small. She had apologized before she even understood what she was apologizing for, and the evening had proceeded as every evening before it had. By the end of her second week as Duchess of Wistmore, Clara had begun keeping a small leather diary hidden inside the lining of her jewelry box, the one place in the entire enormous house she felt certain no one else would think to look. She wrote in it only at odd hours, whenever Edmund left for estate business or hunting trips that sometimes kept him away until late afternoon, and the entries, at first hesitant and careful, slowly grew more honest as the days went on. "I do not think I understood," she wrote one gray morning, "what it truly means to belong to someone. I thought love meant being cherished. I am beginning to wonder if, in this house, love simply means being useful." She tucked the diary away quickly whenever she heard footsteps in the hall, terrified of what Edmund might think if he ever found it, though she could not have said exactly why the thought frightened her so much. He had never raised a hand to her. He had never even raised his voice. And yet there was something in the way he looked at her some nights, something proprietary and unyielding, that made her feel less like a wife and more like a possession recently acquired. It was Margaret, the silver-haired housekeeper, who first noticed the change in her. Clara had grown thinner in her cheeks within a fortnight, and there were faint shadows beneath her eyes that no amount of rest during the daylight hours seemed to erase. One afternoon, as Margaret helped her choose a gown for the evening, the older woman paused with a length of blue silk still draped over her arm and studied Clara's reflection in the mirror with an expression of careful concern. "Forgive me for saying so, Your Grace," Margaret said quietly, "but you do not look yourself. Are you sleeping well?" Clara opened her mouth to give the same automatic reassurance she had given everyone, including herself, for 2 weeks running. Instead, to her own surprise, her eyes filled with sudden tears, and she had to press her fingers hard against her lips to keep from making a sound. Margaret set down the silk immediately and crossed the room, taking Clara's trembling hands in her own weathered ones. "There now," she murmured, in a tone far gentler than any Clara had heard since arriving at the hall. "You needn't say anything you don't wish to. But you needn't pretend with me, either." For a long moment, Clara simply cried, quietly and with great effort at control, while Margaret held her hands and said nothing more, offering only the silent comfort of someone who understood, perhaps, more than Clara yet realized. When at last she had composed herself enough to speak, Clara found the words tumbling out before she could stop them. All the exhaustion, all the confusion, all the small, cold fear that had been building inside her since her second night in this house. "I don't know how to make him understand," she finished, wiping her eyes with the handkerchief Margaret had pressed into her hand. "Every time I try to explain how tired I am, he tells me I am ungrateful. He tells me every duchess before me managed." "Is that true, Margaret? Is this simply what it means to be his wife?" Margaret's face, usually so composed, flickered with something that might have been anger, quickly smoothed away. She glanced toward the door, as though checking that no one else could hear before she spoke again, her voice low. "I have served in this house for 20 years, Your Grace, under the old Duke and now his son. I will say only this, and then I must return to my duties before we are noticed speaking so long. You are not the first young bride to sit in that chair and cry the tears you have just cried, but you may be the first to speak of it aloud to someone in this house. That, I think, matters more than you know." Before Clara could ask what she meant, Margaret had gathered the blue silk gown and busied herself with practical matters, discussing hems and sleeve lengths as though the previous moment had not happened at all, though the warmth in her eyes remained, a quiet promise that Clara was not, perhaps, as alone as she had believed. That single conversation changed something in Clara, though she could not have said exactly what. She began to notice things she had not noticed before, the way certain older servants exchanged glances when Edmund entered a room, the way one of the upstairs maids flinched slightly whenever his footsteps sounded in the hall, the way an oil portrait of a young woman in the East Gallery, labeled only as the First Duchess, showed a face far too thin and far too tired for someone who had supposedly died young of a fever. She began asking careful questions, phrased delicately enough to seem like idle curiosity rather than investigation. From an elderly groundskeeper trimming roses in the garden, she learned that the previous Duchess, Edmund's mother, had spent her final years largely confined to her rooms, rarely seen at public events, before passing away when Edmund was still a boy. From a young kitchen maid, nervous and quick to change the subject, she learned that the portrait in the East Gallery was of Edmund's grandmother, who had died at only 26, officially of a wasting illness that no physician of the time had ever properly named. None of it was proof of anything. Clara told herself this firmly, again and again, as she lay awake some nights after Edmund had finally drifted into satisfied sleep beside her. Women died young in every generation, from fevers and childbirth, and 100 other cruel accidents of fate. It meant nothing that 2 women in this family had died before their time. It meant nothing that the servants grew quiet whenever the subject of previous duchesses arose. And yet the seed of doubt Margaret had planted, however unintentionally, continued to grow. Clara began, in small and careful ways, to test the boundaries of her new life. She asked Edmund, one bright afternoon over tea in the garden, whether she might be permitted to write to her old school friend in town, a girl named Grace Whitmore with whom she had shared a desk for 6 years and countless secrets besides. Edmund had smiled his easy smile and told her, of course, she was free to write to whomever she pleased, though he suggested, gently, that perhaps it would be wiser to wait until she was more settled in her new role before inviting old friends to visit, as first impressions among the county's finest families mattered a great deal, and he would not want Grace's manners, however dear the girl might be, to reflect poorly on the hall. It was such a small thing, such a reasonable-sounding thing, that Clara found herself agreeing before she had fully considered what she was agreeing to. It was only later, alone in her room, that she realized Edmund had, without ever once raising his voice or issuing an outright command, managed to postpone the one connection to her old life that might have offered her real comfort. She noticed, too, that letters from her mother seemed to arrive later than they should, their edges sometimes slightly worn, as though they had passed through more hands than necessary before reaching her. She said nothing of this suspicion to anyone, not even Margaret, uncertain whether she trusted her own judgment any more or whether exhaustion had simply begun playing tricks on her mind. The nights, meanwhile, continued their exhausting pattern, and Clara found herself growing quieter, more careful, more practiced at performing contentment during the daylight hours, so that no one, least of all Edmund, would suspect the depth of what she felt after dark. She learned to smile at dinner even when her whole body ached with tiredness. She learned to laugh at his stories even when her mind was elsewhere, calculating how many hours remained until sunrise, how many hours until she might finally rest. It was nearly 3 weeks into her marriage, on an evening when Edmund had ridden out early to inspect a distant tenant farm and was not expected back until well after dark, that Clara finally worked up the courage to seek out Margaret again, this time not to cry, but to ask a question that had been forming in her mind for days. "Margaret," she said, finding the housekeeper in the small linen room off the main corridor, "you said I was not the first young bride to sit and cry in that chair. Was there something you meant by that, something more you did not say?" Margaret set down the stack of folded sheets in her arms and closed the linen room door quietly behind them both, her expression grave in a way that told Clara she had, indeed, chosen her earlier words with great care. "There is a great deal I could tell you, Your Grace," Margaret said slowly, "and a great deal I am afraid to tell you, for reasons I hope you will understand in time, but I will tell you this much today. You are a clever young woman, and clever young women in this house have a way of finding trouble before trouble finds them. Trust your instincts. Do not trust everything you are told. And above all, do not let anyone, however charming, convince you that what you feel in your own body and your own heart is not real." It was not much to go on, but as Clara returned to her rooms that evening, the words settled into her chest like a small, steady flame, the first real spark of resolve she had felt since arriving at Wistmore Hall. Whatever was happening in this grand and beautiful house, whatever pattern had shaped the lives of the duchesses who had come before her, Clara Bennet did not intend to disappear quietly into it the way, it seemed, others might have before her. She did not yet know what she would do with that resolve. She only knew, for the first time in weeks, that she intended to survive this marriage with her spirit intact, whatever it might cost her to do so. The physician arrived at Wistmore Hall on a rainy Tuesday morning, summoned not by Edmund but by Margaret, who had grown alarmed enough by Clara's persistent fatigue and occasional fainting spells to insist, quietly but firmly, that a doctor be sent for while the Duke was away inspecting his northern properties. Dr. Henry Colt was a stout, gray-whiskered man who had served the county's finest families for 30 years, and he examined Clara with the brisk, practiced efficiency of someone who had seen a great many pale young brides in a great many grand houses. "Your pulse is weak," he said, folding his stethoscope back into his bag. "Your color is poor. You have lost weight since your wedding, if I am not mistaken, and you tell me you are sleeping perhaps 4 or 5 hours a night. This is not a mystery, Your Grace. This is exhaustion, plain and simple, and if it continues unchecked, it will do lasting harm to your health." Clara sat very still on the edge of her bed, her hands folded in her lap, uncertain how much honesty she could afford in front of a man who, however kind his manner, was still ultimately employed by the very household causing her distress. "What would you recommend, doctor?" "Rest," he said simply. "A great deal of it, quiet evenings, proper meals. And if I may speak plainly, whatever is disturbing your sleep each night must be addressed directly, or no tonic I prescribe will do you any real good." He did not say more than that, though the careful way he avoided her eyes as he spoke told Clara he understood, or at least suspected, exactly what was disturbing her sleep, and exactly how delicate a subject it was to raise with the young wife of a duke. He left a small bottle of tonic and strict instructions for increased rest, and Margaret saw him to the door herself, exchanging a few quiet words with him in the front hall that Clara could not quite catch from the top of the staircase. When Edmund returned 2 days later, tanned from his travels and in high spirits over a successful negotiation with a neighboring landowner, Margaret informed him, with the careful diplomacy of a woman who had served this family for 2 decades, that the doctor had visited and recommended rest for the young Duchess. Edmund's reaction was not what Clara had feared. He did not grow angry or dismissive or cold. Instead, to her genuine surprise, he seemed almost stricken with concern, sitting beside her on the bed and taking her hand in both of his with an expression of real tenderness. "Clara, why did you not tell me you were unwell? I would never wish to cause you harm. You must tell me these things." For a moment hope flickered in her chest, bright and fragile. Perhaps, she thought, he truly had not understood the toll the nights were taking on her. Perhaps a doctor's warning, delivered through Margaret's careful diplomacy, would succeed where her own quiet protests had failed. That first night after Dr. Colt's visit, Edmund was gentler than he had been in weeks, content to simply hold her and let her rest, and Clara fell asleep with something close to relief loosening the tight knot that had lived in her chest for nearly a month. For 3 nights, this gentler pattern held, and Clara began to believe, cautiously, that things might truly change between them. But by the 4th night, Edmund's restraint had begun to visibly fray. He was quieter at dinner, his jaw tight, his eyes following her with a hunger he seemed to be fighting to contain. When the servants withdrew and they were alone, he stood abruptly and walked to the window, staring out at the dark gardens for a long moment before speaking. "I have tried," he said, his voice tight, "to give you the rest the doctor recommended. But Clara, I am a man and I have needs, and I cannot pretend forever that those needs simply do not exist because it is inconvenient for you." "It is not inconvenience, Edmund," Clara said, forcing herself to hold his gaze despite the tremor in her voice. "I am truly unwell, Dr. Colt said." "Dr. Colt is not the one lying awake beside you every night," Edmund snapped, turning from the window with a sharpness that made her flinch. He caught himself immediately, softening his tone, crossing the room to kneel beside her chair and take her hands again. "Forgive me. I did not mean to raise my voice. I only mean to say that I have been patient, Clara, more patient than any man I know would be. Surely you can find some way to meet me partway." It was the word partway that lodged itself in Clara's mind long after that conversation ended, because it implied, falsely and cruelly, that her exhaustion and his demands existed on some kind of equal footing, 2 reasonable positions requiring reasonable compromise, rather than what they actually were. A healthy man's insistence against a sick woman's need for rest. The gentler pattern did not last. Within a week, the nightly demands had resumed their previous intensity, though now layered with a new element that troubled Clara even more than the exhaustion itself. A simmering resentment in Edmund's eyes whenever she showed any sign of reluctance, as though her tiredness were a personal insult rather than a medical fact. It was during this period that Clara finally worked up the courage to write to her old friend Grace Whitmore, folding the letter small and entrusting it not to the household post, but to a young stable boy named Peter, whom Margaret had quietly vouched for as trustworthy, with instructions to post it from the village rather than from the hall itself. In the letter, Clara did not dare write everything she felt, uncertain whether the letter might somehow be intercepted, but she wrote enough, a few careful sentences about feeling unwell, about missing home, about wishing Grace might visit soon, that she hoped her old friend would read between the lines and understand that something was wrong. Grace's reply arrived nearly 2 weeks later, delivered by the same discreet channel, and it contained news that struck Clara with the force of a physical blow. Grace had, in the course of asking around the village about news of Wistmore Hall, spoken with an elderly woman who had once served as a lady's maid to Edmund's grandmother, the young Duchess in the East Gallery portrait who had died at 26. According to this woman, the grandmother had spent her final 2 years almost entirely confined to her rooms, growing thinner and weaker by the month, attended by a rotating cast of physicians who could never quite agree on a diagnosis, until she finally passed in her sleep on a winter morning that the household staff, even decades later, still spoke of only in hushed and careful tones. Clara read the letter 3 times before she finally allowed herself to cry, sitting alone in the small private sitting room that had become, since her conversation with Margaret weeks earlier, the one place in the entire vast house where she felt she could fully let down her guard. She was not being fanciful, she told herself firmly, wiping her eyes. She was not imagining connections where none existed. There was a pattern here, a pattern spanning at least 2 generations of Hale women, and she had no intention of becoming its next chapter. That resolve carried her through the difficult weeks that followed, weeks in which she began, with Margaret's careful and quiet help, to build a small network of allies within the household. The elderly groundskeeper who remembered the previous duchesses, a kitchen maid who had overheard things she was not meant to hear, and Peter the stable boy, who proved endlessly willing to carry discreet messages beyond the estate walls whenever Clara needed them carried. She learned, piece by careful piece, that Edmund's father had been much the same as his son, that the pattern of exhausting demands followed by dismissive responses to any complaint stretched back at least that far, and possibly further, into a family history that none of the current staff had witnessed firsthand, but all seemed to have heard whispered about at some point during their years of service. She learned that both Edmund's mother and grandmother had, at various points, attempted to seek help from outside the estate, and that both attempts had somehow been quietly discovered and quietly stopped before they could bear fruit. This last piece of knowledge frightened Clara more than anything else she had learned, and it made her far more careful in her own efforts, aware now that whatever plan she eventually formed would need to succeed on the first attempt, because a second attempt might not be permitted at all. Meanwhile, her physical health continued its slow decline despite Dr. Colt's tonic and her own efforts to eat well and rest whenever the daylight hours allowed. She grew paler. Her hands trembled slightly in the mornings until she had eaten something. She found herself, some afternoons, needing to sit down suddenly in the middle of the garden, black spots swimming at the edges of her vision until her breathing steadied again. It was during one such moment, sitting on a stone bench beneath a rose arbor with her head bowed and her breath coming in careful, measured pulls, that she first met Lucy Hartley, Edmund's younger sister, who had come to visit the hall for the first time since Clara's wedding. Lucy was perhaps 2 years older than Clara, with the same sharp Hale features softened into something warmer, and she crossed the garden quickly the moment she saw Clara's condition, kneeling beside the bench with genuine alarm. "Are you unwell? Should I call for someone?" "No," Clara managed, forcing a weak smile. "No, please, I am simply tired." "It will pass in a moment." Lucy studied her with an expression that reminded Clara uncomfortably of Margaret's first careful glance weeks earlier, a look that suggested Lucy understood more than she was saying, and understood it from painful personal experience rather than mere observation. "You are married to my brother," Lucy said quietly, once Clara's breathing had steadied and the color had begun to return to her face. "I do not need to ask what has left you this tired, Clara. I need only look at you to know." Something in Clara's chest cracked open at those words, some final barrier of caution giving way in the face of a kindness she had not expected. "Then you know," she whispered. "You know what it is like." Lucy's eyes, when she finally answered, were bright with tears she did not let fall. "I know what it did to our mother," she said. "I have spent 10 years wondering if I could have done something, said something, while she was still alive to hear it. I do not intend to make the same mistake twice." It was the beginning, though Clara did not fully realize it in that quiet garden moment, of an alliance that would ultimately change everything. In the days that followed her conversation with Lucy in the rose garden, Clara felt something shift inside the walls of Wistmore Hall, subtle but unmistakable, like the first crack of light through a curtain that had been drawn too long. She was no longer entirely alone. Between Margaret's quiet watchfulness, Peter's willingness to carry messages, and now Lucy's fierce, protective presence, Clara began to feel the faint outline of a plan forming, though none of them had yet spoken the word plan aloud. Lucy stayed at the hall for 2 weeks, officially to keep her new sister-in-law company, while Edmund attended to estate matters that kept him occupied through much of each day, though Clara suspected, from certain careful comments Lucy made, that her sister-in-law had actually arranged the timing of her visit deliberately, choosing a period when Edmund's attention would be divided. It was during a quiet afternoon walk along the estate's eastern boundary, well beyond the range of any listening servant, that Lucy finally spoke plainly about what she had witnessed as a child. "Our mother tried 3 times to leave," she said, her eyes fixed on the distant tree line rather than on Clara. "Once she got as far as the county road before father's men caught up with the carriage and brought her back. After that, he never let her travel anywhere without an escort of his own choosing. She stopped trying after that. She simply stopped." "And your grandmother?" Clara asked carefully. "I never knew her. She died before I was born. But the old groundskeeper, the one you've spoken with, he told me once, when he thought I was too young to understand what he meant, that she had written letters near the end, letters asking for help from a cousin in London. The letters were found before they could be sent. After that, she was rarely permitted visitors at all." Clara absorbed this in silence for a long moment, the autumn wind cold against her face despite the wool shawl Margaret had insisted she wear. "Then whatever I attempt," she said slowly, "cannot be a letter that might be found. It cannot be a carriage that might be followed. It must be something they do not expect, something that happens too quickly for anyone to stop." Lucy turned to look at her then, something like admiration flickering across her features. "You sound like a woman with a plan already forming." "Not yet," Clara admitted, "but I am beginning to understand the shape one would need to take." That evening, for the first time since her wedding, Clara found herself unable to maintain her usual careful performance of contentment at dinner. Edmund noticed almost immediately, his sharp eyes tracking the way her hand trembled slightly around her wine glass, the way her responses to his stories came a half-second slower than usual, distracted by thoughts she was working hard to conceal. "You seem distant tonight," he observed, once Lucy had excused herself early, claiming tiredness from the day's walking, leaving Clara alone with her husband for the first time in nearly 2 weeks. "Is something troubling you?" "Only tiredness," Clara said quickly, too quickly, and saw something flicker behind Edmund's eyes, a calculation she did not like the look of. "You and my sister have grown close," he said, not quite a question. "What do the 2 of you discuss on your long walks?" "Nothing of consequence. Gardens, books, the weather." Edmund studied her for a long moment across the candle-lit table, and Clara forced herself to hold his gaze, to keep her expression as smooth and unbothered as she could manage, though her heart hammered against her ribs. Finally, he smiled, though the smile did not quite reach his eyes. "I am glad you have found a friend in Lucy," he said, "though I would caution you, my dear, against believing everything she tells you about our family. She has always had a flair for the dramatic. Our mother's death affected her deeply, and grief has a way of reshaping memories into something darker than they truly were." Clara said nothing, but the careful, deliberate way Edmund delivered this warning told her far more than his actual words. He suspected, if not the specifics of what Lucy had shared, then at least the general nature of it, and he was already working to undermine her trust in his sister before that trust could fully take root. That night, for the first time in weeks, Edmund did not touch her at all, choosing instead to fall asleep with his back to her, a cold silence hanging between them that felt, to Clara's surprise, almost more unsettling than his usual demands. She lay awake long into the night, staring at the canopy above the bed, turning over every word of the conversation, trying to determine whether she had given anything away that might endanger the fragile alliance she and Lucy had begun building. Lucy left 3 days later. Her departure suddenly moved forward from the original 2-week visit to barely 10 days, with Edmund citing urgent estate matters that required Lucy's own household attention back home, a reason so thin that both women understood immediately what was truly happening, though neither dared say so aloud in front of him. In the brief moment they had alone before Lucy's carriage departed, standing in the shadow of the front entrance while a footman loaded the last of the luggage, Lucy pressed a small folded note into Clara's palm. "Do not open it here," she whispered. "Wait until you are alone, and Clara, whatever you decide to do, do it soon. I do not think he will allow me to visit again for a long while, and I fear he grows more watchful of you by the day." Clara waited until she had returned to her private sitting room, the door locked, before unfolding the small note. Inside, in Lucy's careful handwriting, was an address in London belonging to a barrister named Charles Whitby, a family friend from Lucy's mother's side who had, according to the note, successfully helped two other women from great houses secure legal separations from husbands whose behavior, while never quite crossing into anything the law explicitly named as criminal, had nonetheless been judged sufficiently cruel and neglectful of a wife's basic well-being to warrant intervention. Lucy had underlined one sentence twice. He believes exhaustion and deliberate isolation, properly documented by a physician, can constitute grounds if the physician is willing to testify honestly. Clara read the note 3 times before burning it carefully in the small fireplace, watching the paper curl to ash, committing the address to memory with the same fierce determination she had once used to memorize her school lessons. Dr. Colt, she thought, turning the pieces over in her mind. Dr. Colt had already seen enough, already said enough about her exhaustion, that he might be willing to put his observations formally into writing if she could find a safe way to ask him. The opportunity came nearly 3 weeks later, when Clara's fatigue, worsened rather than improved despite her best efforts at rest, brought on a fainting spell severe enough that Margaret, without waiting for permission from Edmund, sent immediately for Dr. Colt again. This time when the physician examined her, his expression was graver than before, his questions more pointed. "Your Grace," he said quietly, once he had finished his examination and Margaret had discreetly ensured they would not be overheard, "I must ask you directly, and I ask you to answer honestly, because your health may depend upon it. Is there anything happening within this household, anything at all, that is preventing you from getting the rest your body so clearly requires?" For a long moment, Clara simply looked at him, weighing the risk of honesty against the risk of continued silence, remembering Lucy's warning that he grows more watchful of you by the day, remembering the fates of the 2 duchesses who had come before her. Finally, she made her decision. "Yes," she said quietly, "there is." What followed was the first fully honest conversation Clara had allowed herself to have with anyone beyond Margaret and Lucy since her arrival at Wistmore Hall, and Dr. Colt listened to every word with the grave, careful attention of a man who had, perhaps, suspected far more than he had ever previously allowed himself to say aloud. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, staring at his own folded hands. "I have served this family for many years," he said finally. "I attended the previous Duchess in her final illness, and I have long harbored certain suspicions I was never brave enough to voice, out of respect for a household that has always paid my fees promptly and treated me, on the surface, with courtesy. I am ashamed to admit that to you now, but I will not make the same mistake twice, Your Grace. If you wish it, I will document everything I have observed about your health, in careful medical language, in a form suitable for a barrister's consideration. It is the very least I owe you, and the very least I owed the women who came before you." Clara felt tears sting her eyes, though this time they were tears of relief rather than despair. "Thank you," she whispered. "I do not know how to thank you enough." "Do not thank me yet," Dr. Colt said, his expression turning serious again. "This will need to be done carefully and quickly and quietly. Men like your husband do not relinquish what they consider theirs without a fight, and I fear, from what you have told me, that this particular fight has claimed more than one woman's life already. We must not give him the chance to add a third name to that list." His words settled over Clara like a cold weight, but beneath the fear, something harder and steadier was taking shape in her chest, a resolve that had been building slowly since her very first conversation with Margaret weeks earlier and now, finally, had somewhere real to go. She was not going to disappear quietly into the pattern that had claimed Edmund's mother and grandmother before her. She had allies now, a physician willing to document the truth, a sister-in-law who had risked her brother's suspicion to point her toward help, a housekeeper who had watched this pattern repeat itself for 20 years and finally found the courage to speak against it. Whatever came next, Clara understood, would require more courage than she had ever needed in her life. But for the first time since the carriage had carried her through the iron gates of Wistmore Hall, She felt something other than fear settling into the space where her exhaustion lived. She felt, however faintly, the first stirrings of hope. Dr. Colt kept his word within the fortnight, arriving at Wistmore Hall under the guise of a routine follow-up visit, and slipping Margaret a sealed envelope during a moment when Edmund had stepped away to speak with his steward about matters of the harvest. Margaret carried the envelope to Clara's private sitting room herself, her weathered hands trembling slightly as she pressed it into Clara's palm, and the two women stood together in tense silence as Clara broke the seal and read the careful, formal medical language within. The letter documented, in precise and damning detail, everything Dr. Colt had observed across his 3 visits. The persistent exhaustion, the weight loss, the fainting spells, the weakened pulse, all attributed, in his professional medical opinion, to a chronic lack of adequate rest that he had personally recommended addressing on multiple occasions without apparent effect. It was not an accusation. It made no mention of Edmund by name, no mention of anything that might be considered scandalous or improper. But to a barrister trained in reading between careful lines, Clara understood. It would say everything that needed saying. "This is enough," Margaret murmured, reading over Clara's shoulder. "This is truly enough. Now we need only find a way to get it to London." That way arrived sooner than either of them expected, and in a form neither had anticipated. 3 days after receiving the letter, Edmund announced at breakfast that he would be traveling to the capital himself for nearly a week, called away by matters concerning his seat in Parliament that could not be postponed. Clara, schooling her features into careful neutrality, expressed appropriate concern about his absence, and Edmund, satisfied by her performance, kissed her forehead and promised to return as quickly as his duties allowed. The moment his carriage disappeared down the long drive, Clara felt something in her chest loosen for the first time in months. She summoned Peter immediately, and trusted him with Dr. Colt's sealed letter along with a carefully worded message of her own explaining her situation to Charles Whitby, the barrister Lucy had recommended, and watched from an upstairs window as the stable boy rode hard toward the village, carrying, she understood, perhaps the only real chance she would ever have of escaping the pattern that had already claimed 2 women in this family before her. The days that followed passed in a strange, suspended tension, Clara alternating between fragile hope and gnawing fear, uncertain whether her letter had reached its destination safely, uncertain whether Edmund's absence was truly what it appeared to be or whether he had somehow already discovered her efforts and was simply biding his time. Margaret kept close watch over the household during this period, alert to any unusual activity among the staff, any sign that word of Clara's actions might have somehow reached ears loyal to the Duke. On the 5th day of Edmund's absence, a response finally arrived, carried by Peter with the same discretion he had shown throughout, hidden inside the lining of a delivery basket meant to look like nothing more than fresh bread from the village bakery. Charles Whitby's letter was brief but unmistakably encouraging. He had reviewed Dr. Colt's medical documentation, along with Clara's own account of her circumstances, and believed there existed sufficient grounds to petition for a legal separation on the basis of cruelty and willful neglect of health, particularly given the corroborating pattern established by the accounts of 2 previous Hale duchesses. He proposed a plan. Clara should travel to London under some plausible pretext, ideally with Lucy's assistance, where he could meet with her directly, formalize the necessary legal documents, and begin proceedings before Edmund had any opportunity to interfere. Clara read the letter twice, her hands trembling with an emotion she could not entirely name, part terror and part something close to exhilaration. A plausible pretext. She turned the phrase over in her mind, already beginning to construct the shape it might take, when a sound from the doorway made her heart nearly stop entirely. "What are you reading so intently?" Edmund stood in the doorway of her sitting room, still dressed in his traveling clothes, dust from the road still clinging to his boots. He had returned 2 full days earlier than expected, and the careful, assessing look on his face told Clara immediately that this early return had been no accident. For one terrible, frozen moment, Clara considered simply crumpling the letter and pretending it was nothing, a note from her mother, an idle bit of correspondence. But she saw, in the same instant, that Edmund's eyes had already fixed on the paper in her hands with an intensity that told her he had seen enough to know it was not idle correspondence at all, and any attempt at deception now would only confirm his suspicions while wasting precious seconds she might need for something more useful. "Edmund," she said, forcing her voice to remain steady even as her heart pounded against her ribs, "I did not expect you back so soon." "Clearly," he said, his voice deceptively mild as he stepped into the room and closed the door behind him with a soft, deliberate click that seemed to echo far louder than it should have. "I received word, while I was in the capital, of certain unusual activity here at the hall during my absence. A stable boy making frequent trips to the village. A physician's letter delivered under unusual secrecy. I confess, Clara, I returned early because I found myself deeply curious what my wife might be occupying herself with while she believed herself unwatched." Clara's mind raced, calculating and recalculating, searching for some path through this moment that did not end in disaster. She thought of Lucy's warning, of the two duchesses before her whose attempts at escape had been discovered and quietly, thoroughly crushed. She thought of Dr. Colt's careful words, "We must not give him the chance to add a third name to that list." "I have not been idle," she said finally, lifting her chin and meeting his eyes directly, drawing on a reserve of courage she had not fully known she possessed until this exact moment. "I have been unwell for months, Edmund, as you know perfectly well, and no amount of tonic or rest has improved my condition, because the cause of my illness has never been addressed. I sought medical documentation of my condition. I sought legal counsel regarding my situation. I am not ashamed of either action, and I will not pretend to be." Something flickered across Edmund's face, surprise, perhaps, at her directness, or something closer to genuine anger at finally being confronted openly rather than managed and placated, as he had grown so accustomed to over the past months. He crossed the room in 3 quick strides and snatched the letter from her hands before she could stop him, his eyes scanning the barrister's careful legal language with visibly mounting fury. "Cruelty," he read aloud, his voice tight with barely controlled rage. "Willful neglect. Is this how you see me, Clara? Is this how you would describe our marriage to strangers in London?" "I would describe our marriage," Clara said, her voice shaking now but refusing to break, "exactly as it has been. You have asked things of me that have made me physically ill, Edmund. You have dismissed every attempt I have made to explain how unwell I have become. And when I finally sought help, quietly and without ever intending to embarrass you publicly, you responded not by asking what you might do differently, but by treating my illness as an act of betrayal against you." For a long, terrible moment, Edmund said nothing at all, simply staring at her with an expression Clara could not fully read, something caught between fury and buried beneath it, a flicker of something that might almost have been shame. He crumpled the barrister's letter in one fist, and Clara braced herself, uncertain what he might do next, uncertain whether the careful, charming man she had married 2 months earlier had ever truly existed at all or whether he had simply been a mask worn to secure exactly what he wanted, the way, perhaps, his father had worn the same mask before him. "You will not leave this house," he said finally, his voice low and hard in a way she had never heard from him before. "Whatever fantasies that barrister has filled your head with, Clara, understand this clearly. I am a duke. I have resources, connections, and influence far beyond anything a country barrister and a frightened young wife can hope to overcome. If you attempt to leave, I will ensure that every door in London closes to you before you ever reach it." The threat hung in the air between them, cold and absolute, and for one terrible moment Clara felt the same crushing despair that must have overwhelmed Edmund's mother and grandmother before her, the same sense of a trap closing with no visible way out. But then she thought of Margaret's 20 years of careful silence finally broken. She thought of Lucy's courage in defying her own brother's suspicion. She thought of Dr. Colt's shame transformed into determined action. She was not, she reminded herself fiercely, facing this alone the way the women before her had been forced to face it. "You may have resources, Edmund," she said quietly, surprising herself with the steadiness that had returned to her voice. "But you no longer have my silence. And I do not think, when the full pattern of this family's history becomes known to the people whose opinions matter to you most, that your resources will protect you quite as thoroughly as you believe." She did not know, in that exact moment, whether her words were entirely true, or whether she was simply drawing on a courage born of desperation, and the fierce, protective anger of a woman who had finally understood that her own survival mattered more than any fear of consequence. But she watched, with something close to grim satisfaction, as a flicker of genuine uncertainty crossed Edmund's face for the very first time since she had known him, the first crack in the absolute confidence that had defined every moment of their marriage thus far. The confrontation was far from over, but for the first time, Clara understood that it was, at last, a genuine confrontation, two people facing each other honestly rather than one performing contentment while the other performed charm. Whatever happened next, she had stopped disappearing quietly into the role she had been assigned. And that, she thought, watching Edmund's jaw tighten with barely suppressed fury, was a victory no threat of his could fully take away from her. In the days following the confrontation in her sitting room, Clara found herself living under a watchfulness far more intense than anything she had experienced before. Edmund did not raise his voice again, did not repeat his threats aloud, but his presence became a constant weight throughout the house, his eyes tracking her movements at every meal, his questions about her day probing in ways that felt less like a husband's ordinary interest and more like an interrogation carefully disguised as conversation. Peter, the stable boy who had carried her letters so faithfully, was dismissed from service within a week, sent away with a small severance and a vague explanation about reorganizing the stable staff that fooled no one, least of all Clara, who understood immediately what his dismissal truly meant. Margaret came to her privately that same evening, her expression grim. "He suspects everyone now," Margaret whispered, glancing toward the door as though Edmund's presence might somehow bleed through the very walls. "We must be more careful than ever. He has begun asking the other servants pointed questions about my movements, about who I speak with and when. I fear I may not be able to help you as freely as before." Clara felt a fresh wave of fear at this news, understanding that the small network of allies she had so carefully built over the preceding months was now under direct threat, each connection representing not just help for herself, but genuine danger for the people who had risked their positions, and perhaps more, to offer her that help. She could not, she realized with sudden, sharp clarity, allow her own escape to come at the cost of Margaret's livelihood, or Dr. Colt's reputation, or Lucy's relationship with her only remaining family. "Then we must move more quickly than we planned," Clara said finally, "before he closes every door entirely." The opportunity, when it came, arrived from an unexpected direction. Dr. Colt, informed through careful, coded correspondence disguised as ordinary medical follow-up letters, arranged for Clara to be examined by a second physician from London, a specialist in matters of the nerves and constitution, ostensibly to provide a more thorough diagnosis of her persistent ill health. This second physician, a colleague of Charles Whitby's from his own network of contacts, arrived at Wistmore Hall under entirely legitimate professional credentials that Edmund, despite his suspicion, found no reasonable grounds to refuse. The examination itself was brief and largely for appearance's sake, conducted with Margaret present as chaperone in accordance with proper etiquette. But in the moments when Edmund stepped out to allow for a portion of the examination to proceed with appropriate privacy, the physician spoke quickly and quietly, relaying a message from Charles Whitby himself. "Mr. Whitby has secured a private audience with a magistrate sympathetic to matters of this nature," the physician murmured, his hands still going through the careful, deliberate motions of a genuine examination in case anyone should enter unexpectedly. "He believes that if you can present yourself directly, in person, along with the medical documentation already gathered, the magistrate may be persuaded to grant an emergency order of protection, separating you from your husband's household while formal separation proceedings are considered. But you must come to London yourself, Your Grace. Written testimony alone will not carry sufficient weight." "How am I to reach London?" Clara asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I am watched at every hour. My letters are monitored. Even my own servants have begun to fear for their positions on my behalf." The physician glanced toward the door, then back at her, his expression grave but not without hope. "There is a charity hospital in the county, Your Grace, one that regularly transfers difficult cases to specialist care in London. If I were to formally recommend, as part of today's examination, that your condition requires immediate specialist attention beyond what can be provided locally, your husband would find it very difficult, in front of witnesses, to refuse such a recommendation without appearing to actively endanger your health. It would provide legitimate grounds for travel that even his suspicion could not easily block." Clara's heart pounded at the audacity and the simplicity of the plan all at once. It was, she realized, exactly the kind of solution that had eluded the women before her, precisely because it required allies willing to risk their own professional standing on her behalf. Allies she had spent months carefully gathering through nothing more than honesty, patience, and the small, quiet kindnesses of people like Margaret who had simply grown tired of watching the same tragedy repeat itself. "Do it," she said. "Please." When Edmund returned to the room moments later, the physician had already begun composing his formal recommendation, his tone grave and professionally concerned, as he explained to the Duke that the Duchess's condition showed signs requiring specialized treatment unavailable in the county, treatment that could be arranged promptly through the charity hospital's established transfer arrangements with a private clinic in London. Clara watched Edmund's face carefully as he listened, saw the calculation working behind his eyes, weighing the risk of appearing to obstruct his wife's medical care against whatever suspicion still lingered from their earlier confrontation. In the end, as the physician had predicted, appearances won out. A duke who refused his ailing wife access to necessary medical treatment, in front of a respected London physician who would certainly remember such a refusal, was a duke, inviting exactly the kind of scandal Edmund had spent his entire life carefully avoiding. "Of course," Edmund said finally, his voice tight but controlled. "Her health must come first. I will arrange for a proper escort." "Of course," the physician agreed smoothly. "Though I would recommend, given the delicate nature of her condition, that the journey be undertaken with minimal disruption. Perhaps the Duchess's own lady's maid would provide more comfort than an unfamiliar escort during what may prove an emotionally taxing journey." It was a small thing, a seemingly reasonable suggestion, but Clara understood immediately what the physician had just accomplished. By recommending Margaret specifically, under the guise of the housekeeper's long familiarity with Clara's needs, he had ensured that her one true ally within the household would accompany her to London, rather than some servant loyal only to Edmund. 3 days later, Clara's carriage departed Wistmore Hall with Margaret seated beside her, both women maintaining careful, composed expressions for the benefit of the household staff gathered to see them off. Though Clara's hands trembled with a mixture of terror and fragile hope throughout the entire journey down the long drive, and through the iron gates that had, 4 months earlier, closed behind her with such finality. The journey to London took the better part of 2 days, Clara and Margaret speaking little during the long hours in the carriage, both women aware that even now, even with the gates of Wistmore Hall finally behind them, nothing was yet certain. Edmund had insisted, despite the physician's careful suggestion, on providing his own driver and a single armed outrider, ostensibly for their protection on the road, though both women understood the true purpose was simply continued observation. It was only when they finally arrived at the address Charles Whitby had provided, a modest but respectable townhouse in a quiet London square, that Clara allowed herself to feel the first genuine flicker of something like safety. Whitby himself, a lean, sharp-eyed man in his middle years, met them at the door personally, ushering them quickly inside before any watching eyes on the street could take too careful note of their arrival. "Your Grace," he said, once they were settled in his private study with the door firmly closed. "I must commend your courage in coming this far. But I must also be honest with you about what remains ahead. The magistrate I mentioned has agreed to hear your case tomorrow morning, but your husband will almost certainly attempt to intervene the moment he learns of your true purpose here. And I suspect, given the driver and outrider he insisted upon, that he may already have some means of learning of your movements sooner than we would like." Clara felt the fragile hope in her chest tighten into something harder and more determined. "Then we must ensure the magistrate hears my case before Edmund has any opportunity to prevent it." Whitby nodded, already reaching for a stack of papers on his desk. "That is precisely my intention, Your Grace. Dr. Colt's documentation, the testimony I have gathered from the servants at Wistmore regarding the fates of the two previous duchesses, and your own account, which I will need to record formally tonight, should provide more than sufficient grounds. But I will not pretend this will be easy. Your husband is a peer of the realm with considerable influence of his own. We must present a case so clear, so thoroughly documented, that even his standing cannot easily overcome it." That night in the small guest room Whitby's household provided, Clara sat for nearly 3 hours giving her full and honest account of the past 4 months, every detail of exhaustion and isolation and dismissed complaints, while Whitby's clerk recorded every word in careful, formal legal language. Margaret sat beside her throughout, offering quiet support, and when needed, her own corroborating testimony about the changes she had witnessed in Clara's health and spirit since the wedding. By the time the candle finally burned low and Whitby declared they had gathered more than enough for tomorrow's hearing, Clara felt hollowed out by exhaustion but also, for the first time in months, genuinely hopeful. Whatever happened in the magistrate's chambers the following morning, she had done everything within her power to ensure her voice, and the voices of the women who had come before her and never had the chance to speak, would finally be heard. She slept that night more deeply than she had in weeks, though she woke before dawn, her heart already racing with anticipation of the day ahead, uncertain whether it would bring her freedom or drag her back into the pattern she had fought so hard to escape. The magistrate's chambers occupied a narrow stone building tucked behind the main court, unassuming from the outside but formal and imposing within, all dark wood paneling and tall shelves of legal volumes that seemed to Clara, as she entered on Whitby's arm with Margaret close behind, to represent every obstacle a woman of her position might face in trying to be taken seriously by the machinery of law. Magistrate Aldous Price was an older man with sharp, careful eyes that assessed her thoroughly as she took her seat, and Clara understood immediately that whatever sympathy Whitby had described him possessing, it would need to be earned through the strength of her testimony rather than assumed as a given. Whitby presented the case methodically, beginning with Dr. Colt's medical documentation, then moving through the corroborating testimony gathered from Wistmore's servants regarding the fates of Edmund's mother and grandmother, and finally allowing Clara herself to speak directly to the magistrate about her own experience. Clara found her voice steadier than she had expected, months of careful, quiet suffering finally given an outlet in words that mattered, words that might, for the first time, actually change something. "I do not come here seeking to destroy my husband's reputation," she said, meeting the magistrate's steady gaze directly. "I come here because I have watched my own health decline month after month, because I have been told repeatedly that my exhaustion is a failing of gratitude rather than a genuine medical concern, and because I have learned, through careful inquiry, that I am not the first woman in this family to find herself in exactly this position. I ask only for protection, and for the chance to determine my own future, rather than watching that future be decided entirely by demands I have no power to refuse." Magistrate Price listened without interruption, his expression giving away little, though Clara thought she saw something shift in his eyes as she spoke of the two previous duchesses. A flicker of recognition, perhaps, of a pattern he himself might have heard whispered about in other contexts over his long career. It was at this precise moment, as Whitby was preparing to present his final formal request for an emergency protective order, that the chamber door burst open without ceremony, and Edmund strode in, his face flushed with fury and travel, having clearly ridden through the night upon learning of Clara's true purpose in London. "This is an outrage," he announced, his voice filling the small chamber with the practiced authority of a man accustomed to commanding attention. "My wife has been taken from our home under false medical pretenses and brought here to make wild accusations against me, accusations without any foundation in fact." Magistrate Price, unmoved by the interruption, regarded Edmund with the same careful, assessing look he had given Clara moments before. "Your Grace, this hearing is currently in session, and you will have opportunity to respond to the claims presented, but you will do so through proper procedure rather than by bursting unannounced into my chambers. Please be seated." Edmund's jaw tightened visibly at being addressed in such a manner, clearly unaccustomed to having his authority challenged so directly by anyone. But he took the offered seat, his eyes fixed on Clara with an intensity that made her stomach tighten despite her earlier resolve. For a moment, the old fear threatened to overwhelm her, the years of learned deference to his wishes rising up like a tide she had to consciously push back against. "Your Grace," Whitby said, addressing Edmund directly now, "the documentation presented today includes formal medical testimony regarding your wife's declining health, corroborating accounts from multiple members of your household staff, and testimony regarding a documented pattern affecting your mother and grandmother before her. I would ask that you respond to these specific claims rather than characterizing them broadly as baseless." Edmund's composure, so carefully maintained through months of charm and control, finally began to crack under the direct pressure of formal legal scrutiny. "My wife is young," he said, his voice tight, "unaccustomed to the demands of a great household and prone to exaggeration when tired. As for my mother and grandmother, they suffered from illnesses entirely unrelated to anything my wife's barrister is implying. I fail to see how ancient family history has any bearing on my own marriage." "And yet," Magistrate Price interjected, his voice quiet but carrying an unmistakable weight of authority, "your wife has presented formal medical documentation of significant physical decline since her marriage, documentation from a physician who has served your family for many years, and would have little motive to fabricate such claims. She has also presented corroborating testimony from your own household staff, individuals who would risk their positions to speak against you, unless they believed the matter serious enough to warrant such risk. I find myself, Your Grace, considerably less inclined to dismiss this as mere youthful exaggeration than you might wish." The chamber fell silent for a long, tense moment, Edmund's eyes still fixed on Clara, though now the fury in them had begun to shift into something closer to genuine alarm, the first crack in his absolute confidence that this confrontation, like every previous one, would ultimately bend to his will simply because he expected it to. "What is it you want, Clara?" he said finally, his voice quieter now, almost pleading in a way she had never heard from him before. "Tell me plainly, and perhaps we can resolve this without further scandal to either of us." Clara considered his question carefully before answering, aware that this moment, more than any other in the past 4 months, would shape everything that followed. "I want," she said slowly, "protection from further harm and the freedom to determine my own future rather than having it decided for me by demands I have no power to refuse. I do not say this out of cruelty toward you, Edmund. I say it because I have watched what silence and endurance did to your mother and your grandmother, and I refuse to let it be done to me as well." Magistrate Price studied the two of them for a long moment before finally speaking, his tone formal and measured. Given the medical documentation presented, the corroborating testimony of household staff, and the concerning pattern established across multiple generations of this family, I am prepared to grant an emergency order of protection, separating the Duchess from the Wistmore household pending a full and formal review of the circumstances by proper ecclesiastical and legal authorities. This order will remain in effect until such review is completed. Your Grace, he added, addressing Edmund directly, I would strongly advise you to seek your own legal counsel and to reflect seriously on the pattern that has now been formally documented within your family across 3 generations of wives. The words settled over the chamber with a finality that made Clara's breath catch. 4 months of careful, exhausting effort finally, unbelievably, bearing fruit. She did not look at Edmund as the magistrate's clerk began drawing up the formal order, uncertain what she might see in his expression and unwilling, in this moment of hard-won victory, to let any lingering fear or doubt creep back into her resolve. It was only as she and Margaret finally left the chamber, the formal order safely in Whitby's careful keeping, that Clara allowed herself to look back once, briefly, at Edmund, still seated where the magistrate had left him, his face pale and drawn in a way she had never seen before, the charming, confident Duke who had swept her off her feet in a small country town replaced by someone smaller. Someone finally forced to confront the consequences of a pattern he had inherited and continued, without ever once questioning its cost to the women who loved him. She felt in that final glance not triumph exactly, but something quieter and more complicated. Relief, certainly, and a fierce, protective pride in her own survival, but also a strange, unexpected trace of sorrow for the man he might have been, had he ever chosen differently. Then she turned and walked out through the chamber doors into the bright London afternoon, Margaret's steady hand on her arm, and did not look back again. The weeks that followed the magistrate's ruling passed in a strange, suspended rhythm for Clara, half relief and half uncertainty, as she settled into a small rented house in a quiet London neighborhood that Whitby had helped her secure using funds drawn from her own modest inheritance. Funds Edmund's lawyers had initially tried to contest before ultimately conceding. Unwilling to drag the details of the case any further into public scrutiny than the magistrate's formal order had already made unavoidable, Margaret had chosen, without hesitation, to remain in Clara's service rather than return to Wistmore Hall, a decision that touched Clara deeply given everything the older woman had already risked on her behalf. 20 years in that house was long enough, Margaret said simply, when Clara asked if she was certain. I would rather spend whatever years remain to me helping build something better than watching the same pattern repeat itself with whatever poor girl Edmund chooses next, should he ever choose to remarry. That last thought had settled uneasily in Clara's mind in the weeks since, a nagging worry she could not quite set aside even amid her own hard-won freedom. It was Lucy, arriving unannounced at Clara's small London house barely a month after the ruling, tears in her eyes as she embraced her sister-in-law for the first time as something closer to a true friend than a cautious ally, who finally offered a path forward for that worry as well. I have spoken with our family solicitors, Lucy said, once they were settled with tea in Clara's modest but comfortable parlor. Given the formal documentation now on record regarding our mother, our grandmother, and yourself, there exists a genuine legal argument that Edmund's conduct constitutes grounds for a much broader intervention than simply your own separation. I intend to pursue it, Clara, whatever it costs me in terms of family standing. I will not stand by and watch him do this to another woman. Clara reached across the small table and took Lucy's hand, understanding fully now the depth of courage such a decision required from a woman still bound, in ways Clara herself no longer was, to the Hale family name and all its social weight. You do not have to do this alone, she said. Whatever help I can offer, whatever testimony or documentation, you have only to ask. Over the following months, the case against Edmund grew into something far larger than either woman had initially anticipated, as Whitby's careful, methodical investigation uncovered additional testimony from servants who had witnessed the treatment of Edmund's mother directly, and even, remarkably, a diary belonging to the grandmother in the East Gallery portrait, discovered hidden within the lining of an old trunk in the hall's extensive attics, its pages describing in painful private detail the same pattern of exhaustion and dismissal that Clara herself had experienced generations later. The formal proceedings that followed drew considerably more public attention than any of them had initially wished, the scandal eventually reaching the pages of London's newspapers in carefully worded accounts that spoke of irregularities and concerns regarding the conduct of a peer toward his household. Language vague enough to avoid outright legal complication, but clear enough that anyone reading closely could understand the true shape of what had occurred across 3 generations at Wistmore Hall. Edmund, for his part, chose ultimately not to contest the full weight of the evidence, once it became clear how thoroughly documented the pattern truly was. He accepted a formal separation from Clara, along with a legally binding agreement overseen by the ecclesiastical courts that placed strict conditions on any future marriage he might seek to enter, conditions that included regular medical review of his wife's health by an independent physician, terms so unusual and so clearly born of scandal that Clara understood they would likely follow him, in whispered rumor if nothing else, for the rest of his life. She felt, when she finally read the terms of the settlement in Whitby's office nearly 8 months after her arrival in London, a complicated mixture of emotions she had not fully anticipated. There was relief, certainly, and a fierce satisfaction in knowing that whatever woman Edmund eventually married, should he choose to marry again, would have far more protection than Clara herself had possessed on her own wedding night. But there was also, unexpectedly, a quiet grief for the 4 months of her life spent trapped within a pattern she had not chosen and could not have anticipated, months that had cost her not just her health, but a piece of the easy trust in the world she had carried with her before arriving at Wistmore Hall's iron gates. It was Margaret, sensing this quiet grief during one of their evening conversations by the fire in Clara's small parlor, who finally offered the words that helped Clara begin to make peace with everything that had happened. "You did not fail by trusting him at first," Margaret said gently. "No one deserves blame for believing a kind face and a charming voice, especially when that face and voice work as hard as his did to earn such trust. The failure, if there was one, belonged entirely to him, and to a family pattern that convinced generations of men they were owed whatever they wanted, regardless of the cost to the women who loved them. What matters now, Clara, is not that you were once deceived. What matters is that you found the courage to stop being deceived, and to help make certain it does not happen again to someone else." Those words stayed with Clara through the following years, as she slowly rebuilt a life entirely her own, first through quiet friendships formed with other women whose paths had crossed hers during the long months of legal proceedings, then through a growing correspondence with women across the county who had heard, through careful whispers and the occasional newspaper account, that the young Duchess of Wistmore had found the courage to speak against a pattern many had suffered in silence, and who wrote to her seeking guidance or simply the comfort of knowing they were not alone. Clara answered every letter personally, drawing on everything Margaret, Lucy, Dr. Colt, and Whitby had taught her about the slow, careful work of building allies, gathering evidence, and finding courage even when every circumstance seemed designed to enforce silence instead. She never remarried, choosing instead to build a life centered around her small London household, her deepening friendship with Lucy, and the quiet, meaningful work of helping other women recognize, far sooner than she herself had managed, the difference between genuine love and the careful performance of it. Years later, when Clara was asked, by a young woman who had written seeking her advice after a troubling first year of marriage, what single piece of wisdom she would offer to any bride stepping through unfamiliar gates into an unfamiliar life, Clara thought for a long while before answering, remembering the carriage ride through Wistmore's iron gates, the candle-lit dinners, the slow, dawning realization that something was deeply wrong beneath the surface of a fairy tale she had been so eager to believe. "Trust the voice inside yourself," she finally wrote, "the one that notices when something feels wrong long before you have the words or the courage to say so aloud. That voice is not selfishness, and it is not ingratitude, whatever anyone tells you. It is the truest friend you will ever have, and it deserves to be listened to, especially when the people around you insist, gently or otherwise, that you should learn to ignore it." She sealed the letter, added it to the small, growing collection of correspondence that had, in its own quiet way, become the true legacy of everything she had survived, and looked out her parlor window at the ordinary London street beyond, filled with ordinary people living ordinary lives, none of them aware of the extraordinary courage it had taken for the woman watching them to reclaim a life entirely her own. Somewhere far to the north, Wistmore Hall still stood behind its iron gates, its long corridors and candle-lit dining halls now home to a chastened duke living largely alone, his reputation forever marked by the scandal his own family's pattern had finally, inevitably produced. But in the small London house where Clara Bennett had rebuilt her life from the ground up, surrounded by friends who had become something closer to family, there was, at last, only quiet and peace, and the simple, hard-won freedom of a life lived entirely on her own terms. 5 years passed before Clara returned, for the first and only time, to the county where Wistmore Hall still stood, drawn back not by any desire to see Edmund again, but by an invitation from Lucy, who had finally married a quiet, steady schoolmaster named George Ashworth, and settled into a modest house barely 3 miles from the estate where she and Edmund had grown up together. Clara accepted the invitation with a mixture of nervousness and curiosity, uncertain how it would feel to stand once more on ground so heavy with memory. The county, she found, had changed more than she expected in her absence. Word of the Wistmore case had traveled widely enough, in the careful, whispered way such scandals traveled through polite society, that Clara found herself regarded not with pity, as she had feared, but with a kind of quiet, respectful curiosity by the women she met during her visit, several of whom approached her directly to thank her, in low voices, for having the courage to speak when so many others in similar circumstances had felt they could not. One such woman, a baroness from a neighboring estate whose own marriage had grown quietly troubled in ways she had never previously voiced to anyone, sought Clara out during a small gathering at Lucy's house, drawing her aside into a quiet corner of the garden with an urgency that reminded Clara sharply of her own desperate early weeks at Wistmore Hall. "I do not know how to ask this properly," the Baroness said, her hands twisting nervously in her lap, "but I have heard what you did, how you found the courage to seek help when your own husband refused to listen. I wonder, Your Grace, if you might tell me how you first knew, truly knew, that what you were experiencing was not simply the ordinary difficulty of marriage, but something that deserved to be named and addressed directly." Clara considered the question carefully, recognizing in the Baroness's careful, hesitant phrasing the same doubt and self-questioning that had plagued her own first weeks at Wistmore Hall. The same instinct to assume her own suffering must simply be a failure of gratitude or resilience rather than a legitimate response to genuine harm. "I knew," Clara said slowly, "when I realized that my own body was telling me something my mind kept trying to talk myself out of believing. Exhaustion is not weakness. Fear is not ingratitude. If something in your marriage is making you unwell, truly unwell, in body or spirit, that is worth taking seriously, regardless of how ordinary anyone tries to convince you such suffering should feel." The Baroness's eyes filled with tears, and for a long moment the two women simply sat together in Lucy's quiet garden, saying nothing more, the Baroness absorbing words she had perhaps needed to hear for a very long time. Before the gathering ended that evening, Clara had given her the address of Charles Whitby's London office, along with a promise of her own continued correspondence and support, should the Baroness ever find herself ready to take the same difficult steps Clara herself had once taken. It was during this same visit that Clara finally allowed herself, with Lucy's quiet encouragement, to walk once more along the edge of Wistmore's grounds, close enough to see the hall's familiar chimneys rising above the tree line, but not so close as to risk any direct encounter with Edmund himself, who Lucy reported still lived largely in seclusion, his once considerable social standing diminished by years of quiet whispers he had never fully managed to outrun. Standing at the edge of the property where her carriage had once passed through iron gates toward a life she had believed, in her innocence, would be nothing but happiness, Clara felt none of the fear that memory might once have summoned. Instead, she felt something closer to a quiet, hard-won peace, the recognition that whatever pain those months had caused her, she had ultimately transformed that pain into something that had already helped, and would likely continue to help, other women recognize and escape patterns they might otherwise have suffered through in silence, exactly as 2 generations of Hale Duchesses had suffered before her. Dr. Colt, now retired from active practice but still occasionally consulted on difficult cases, wrote to her that same year to share that his careful documentation of Clara's case, along with the subsequent legal proceedings it had helped set in motion, had become something of a quiet reference point among physicians and barristers dealing with similarly difficult domestic circumstances, a precedent that made it slightly easier, in at least some corners of the legal and medical establishment, for a woman's documented physical suffering to be taken seriously as grounds for intervention, rather than dismissed as feminine delicacy or exaggeration. Margaret, who had remained with Clara through every year since their departure from Wistmore Hall, had grown into something closer to family than employee. And it was Margaret who, on the evening before Clara's return journey to London, finally asked the question that had perhaps been sitting unspoken between them since the very beginning of their long association. "Do you ever regret it?" Margaret asked quietly, as they sat together by Lucy's fire on Clara's final night in the county. "The marriage, I mean." "Everything that came after." Clara thought about the question for a long time before answering, watching the firelight flicker across the familiar, weathered lines of Margaret's face, remembering the very first conversation the two of them had shared in that small linen room off the main corridor, the moment when Margaret's careful kindness had first cracked open the isolation Clara had been so carefully, silently enduring. "I regret the pain," Clara said finally. "I regret what it cost me, and what it had already cost 2 women before me. But I do not regret who I became because of it. I do not think I would have found the strength to build the life I have now, to help the women I have helped since, if I had never been forced to fight for my own survival in the first place. I would not choose to relive those months, but I would not undo the woman they made me either." Margaret reached over and took Clara's hand, the same gentle, weathered grip that had first offered comfort in that small linen room 5 years earlier, and the two women sat together in comfortable silence as the fire slowly burned low. Two survivors of a story neither of them could have imagined, on the ordinary night they first met, would end in anything resembling triumph. The next morning, Clara's carriage carried her away from the county and back toward London, back toward the small house that had become her true home, back toward the growing circle of women who continued to write to her seeking guidance, back toward a life built not on the fragile foundation of a fairy tale that had nearly cost her everything, but on the far sturdier foundation of her own hard-won strength, her own carefully chosen family of friends and allies, and the quiet, steady knowledge that whatever challenges her future might still hold, she would never again mistake silence for safety or endurance for love. Behind her, the county grew smaller in the carriage window, the distant chimneys of Wistmore Hall finally disappearing entirely beyond the hills, and Clara Bennet, once Duchess of Wistmore, now simply and entirely herself, looked forward instead toward London, toward home, toward whatever came next in a life she had fought so hard, and so successfully, to reclaim as her own.